Thank you for joining us at the Advice for Reapplicants session. We are the University of Washington School of Medicine Office of Admissions. We're so pleased that you've joined us today to talk about advice for reapplicants. Next slide, please. I want to start off by talking about our goal. So what we'd like to do today is give you all the tools that can help reapplicants, you as reapplicants, evaluate your candidacy and find ways to improve. In order to do that, we're going to talk a little bit about our mission and how we review all applicants according to our mission. Then we'll talk specifically about how we review reapplicants. We'll look at some data, and then we'll give you some key points to consider when you're reflecting on your own candidacy and interview. Then we'll move to a live Q&A session. We do have a Q&A opportunity here where you can put in your questions so that we can respond to those here live today. Next slide, please. So we always like to start by talking about our mission. Medical schools base their admissions process and their class on their mission. We want to make sure we have a class that's aligned with our mission and values. So the School of Medicine at the University of Washington is committed to WWAMI, Washington, Wyoming, Alaska, Montana, and Idaho. We want to meet the healthcare needs of this region, including the diverse patient populations we serve, recognizing that in order to meet the needs of our region, we do need more primary care physicians, and we need to be able to serve our underserved communities. We also find great value in advancing knowledge and particularly in the biomedical sciences and academic medicine, and we want to make sure we're providing educational opportunities for all learners. Those sort of thoughts are the basis of our process. When we're reviewing applicants, we're looking for folks who will align with those values. I want to point out, you do not have to meet every one of these, right? You don't have to align with every single mission point that we have. This is sort of a bullet pointed version of our mission. The full mission is on our website. I can pop the link in the chat. But our mission is multifaceted. If there are parts of it that speak to you, we want to make sure that you're reflecting that in your application and your interview. So a successful applicant to our school has shown us through their experiences, their reflections, and their goals, how they align with our mission. The committee is going to read your entire application. They're going to try to figure out who you are and how you would contribute to our community and align with our mission. So I point that out because the sort of how you align with our mission isn't necessarily just one piece of the application. It can be throughout the application in different pieces. Thank you. Next slide.
All right, so to get us started a little bit here, we took some questions during registration, and we grouped them and sort of talked about them in different sort of themes, and a bunch of them were about sort of procedural things. So we wanted to cover that first. We got a whole bunch about sort of how are reapplicants evaluated? Are they looked at differently than first-time applicants? Is there something specific that the committee is looking for in reapplicants that they're not looking for in first-time applicants? They're sort of all along that thread. And the short answer is that we have the same expectations for all our applicants. So really, wherever somebody is in their application journey, whether they are right out of college, whether they're a career changer, whether they're a first-time applicant or a third-time applicant, the committee is looking at all the people through the same lens and trying to, like Sarah said, find the folks who help us meet our mission in those different ways. A great place to start thinking about sort of what are those expectations that we have for all of our applicants are the AAMC competencies, which are, just as a really good place to sort of start and make sure you look at when you're thinking about your medical school application process. We also got a number of questions about whether reapplicants are accepted at a different rate than first-time applicants, whether there's sort of differences in the data there. And the answer there is no. So equity is really important to our team and to the admissions committee. And we have done some data analysis and we've looked at this a number of times over the past many years. And we just did it before this presentation. And the data consistently shows that first-time applicants and reapplicants are accepted at approximately the same rate. This doesn't factor in that some reapplicants apply in back-to-back cycles and some take, some years off in between. So that certainly is, can be a factor, but it really is, overall, the numbers look pretty consistent. We also understandably got questions about whether the admissions committee can see your previous application or previous applications. And this is different at every medical school. It actually is different in our process in the last few years. Admissions committee members used to be able to see the previous application. They cannot anymore. So we keep track in our office about who interviewed applicants previously, who screened them previously, so that we're not having those same people review the same applicants again. But the admissions committee members can't see that. They can see how many applications someone has had and how many completed applications somebody has had. And then lastly, bunch of questions about essentially, should I rewrite my experiences and or my personal statement? And the answer to that is yes. So, it looks different, obviously, for every applicant. Every applicant's coming from a different place, but the short answer is that yes, you should do a deep dive into your application and really think about every piece of what you wrote and think if that is the best way to say what you want to say and the best way to get across what you want to get across. And the admissions committee is not comparing one application to the other, but that doesn't mean that you should just sort of say, oh yeah, I was an alternate. This is probably fine, right? That's what we're talking about today in terms of, we have a bunch of other sort of advice and guidelines, but do some deep reflection about what is.
Looks like our colleague may have lost their internet briefly, but that's okay. We can maybe do the next slide for now, which happens to be my slide. So one thing that reapplicants have to work with on their secondary application is an additional question that is specific to them. And basically, it can be summed up as, please share any areas of growth since your previous application and what you've learned from the process. And so just in general, I do want to emphasize that this is not intended to single you out as a failed prior applicant or to be used to highlight why your previous applications may have been insufficient. What this is intended to be is a space to talk about the exciting opportunities and the growth and what you've been trying out and focusing on since your last application in order to reinforce your candidacy as an MD student. This is a space, it's about one paragraph where you can show your intent and resolve to be an MD candidate. First-time applicants do not have the luxury of getting this. This is basically an extra paragraph for you to say nice things about yourself and to talk about why you are the perfect person for this. But importantly, if you can't think of anything to put in this space, this is actually a really good sign that maybe you're not ready to reapply. Maybe you need to work on some more parts of your application. Maybe you need to try something new or different, or consider reframing how you think about your application. Basically, if you can't think of anything to put in this paragraph in terms of how you might have grown as an applicant since your last time applying, consider waiting another cycle and being more intentional about what you are doing to prepare to be an MD student. And next slide, please. And then another little bit of data that we ran for our uh, applicants who did not make it past the initial screening stage, which is like after you submit your secondary application, um, is figuring out why they didn't make it past that stage. So a common misconception is that if you were rejected during screening or before you got an interview, it is because your MCAT or GPA was too low. This is categorically just like not true for the most part. So out of over 2,000 applicants that we rejected, that were rejected before interview, the most commonly chosen reasons for rejecting someone were a better understanding of a medical field, getting more clinical exposure, or more life experience, as you can see on these percentages on the side. And so applicants are typically given one or more of these, so it's not like somebody is rejected for a single reason, which is also another thing to reflect on in your application, is that it's like rarely one thing, but it's almost always not the academics themselves. And so another thing to bear in mind with these reasons that are stated here is that it doesn't actually necessarily mean that somebody does not understand the medical field when they are applying, or that they don't have enough clinical exposure. It could also very well be that they were not able to convey this well enough in their application, uh, for the person who is for the individuals that were screening in them to get that. Um, so when you are evaluating your previous applications, it's kind of important for yourself to sort of figure out which one of these do you think it may have been, and is another good reason for why we encourage folks to review and rewrite their applications in follow-up years in order to make sure that they are selling themselves and conveying these points as strongly as they can. And next slide, please.
As you reflect on your candidates, so you look back on your previous application, these are some things to kind of keep in mind and think about as you are deciding how to approach the next coming up application. So first of all, I want to point out that the number of hours you spend on any given experience or on all your experiences as a whole is not really what the committee are looking at. Um, I mean, of course, there's a difference between doing something for 4 hours and doing something for 400 hours. But, the difference between 40 and 60 or 100 and 120, these aren't the things that the committee are looking at. What they're really looking at is the reflections, the way you describe not just what you did, but what what those experiences really meant. And it's not just what it meant in terms of I learned this or I worked with this population. It's what was the deep influence on you? What influence did you have on other people? What is all the value wrapped up in that? So think about those kinds of questions. Really try to reflect deeply on the meaning, the impact that you may have had or that others may have had on you throughout those experiences and how they tied to each other. So your experiences aren't just individual, I did this, that's done in its own little box. I did this, that's done in its own little box. But this is a whole learning process where each experience you have influences your other experiences and builds the entirety of who you are in this application. Some things to think about as you're kind of evaluating, well, how do I do that? How do I write about this is meaning, what meaning this has for me? Think about whether these experiences challenge you by putting yourself in new experiences, doing different things, or are you just repeating the same kinds of experiences over and over? What growth are you experiencing through these? And how are you showing that? How is that evident throughout your application, both in the description of your experiences, but also in all the ways that you can put different pieces together in the application. As you're looking at your experiences, how narrow are they? And that's not just in terms of doing the same kinds of things, but for example, what institution are you doing things through? Are you doing it all through your college or university, for example? Are you in a fraternity and sorority and everything that you've done as a service experience is through that? Which isn't to say that those are not valuable, of course, but that it can be more compelling if you're seeking out a variety of different kinds of experiences to involve yourself in. As you do that, what it really demonstrates is a greater deal of intentionality and your own personal initiative. So you're showing not just, I was led into this experience, but I led myself through this experience or to find it or to do it. So it's really about your own personal drive to do the things that you're doing rather than someone else leading you to those things. Do your experiences support your goals? This is a really important thing to think about. And this can be throughout many different ways, but a really common example is that applicants will come in and express an interest in a particular field in medicine. Maybe they say, I really want to work in surgery. But then if we look at the experiences that you have, you never did anything to explore surgery. That's what we're talking about here. Do your experiences support your goals? If you're stating that you have a goal, whatever that is, whether that's a particular specialty, whether it's working with a particular population, if you're expressing that as your goal, it's important that we're able to see that you've explored it to some extent. Doesn't mean you have to be a master in it. Doesn't mean you have to have the greatest depth of knowledge in this field. But if you're saying, I really want to do this, and you've never done anything to show that you have an interest or that you've explored that, it doesn't really present a compelling argument for those are your goals and you want to pursue those goals and you're preparing yourself for those goals. So work hard to make sure that any goals that you do present, you have some kind of backing for that, something to show that you've explored it. It's not necessary for you to say, this is a specialty that I want to go into. Many people come in without an intended specialty. Also, many come in with a stated intent, and then throughout the course of medical school, they completely change what they end up doing in the long run. So don't feel like you have to be tied to it. Don't feel that you have to say, I already know what I want to do. I want to be this kind of doctor. Present what's true to yourself and what is backed up by the experiences that you have. Next slide, please.
So, hi everyone. I'm going to talk about what happens if you interviewed and you were unsuccessful, and how you can best identify what might have been the reasons that resulted in a unsuccessful application, and also help pinpoint what might be the areas that you may want to pay attention to or kind of refocus before you apply again. So one common reason is when the interviewers are talking with you about your goals and your experiences, what might have come up is just a misalignment of what you want to do and what we hope to accomplish in our program. So one of the advice I would probably give is to just kind of check our mission statement. And ideally, you would have read about the mission statement before you submit the application, and just think about what you've done. And do those really kind of line up with what our program really finds important and what we really hope to accomplish? Are your activities consistent with the communities that we want to serve? Are your stated interests communicated in the interview if it was not already in the application? And something to be mindful of is that we're also looking to see with your written application, we have your written application, but in the interview is an opportunity for us to learn more about what other experiences and stories you might have, as well as be able to kind of flesh out some of the perspectives you've already shared, and maybe hear more about other activities. And also just to make sure that what you wrote in your application is consistent with what is being, what you're sharing with the interviewers. And while we recognize that memory can be, it's a little bit hard to kind of recall 100% accurately how the interview went when some time has passed, I think I still want to encourage folks to kind of think about, were there any specific questions that you might have struggled with in the interview, and were there a pattern to those types of questions? Was there were the questions that you may have struggled with were related to current topics? Perhaps that might be a sign that you want to stay more up to date in regards to news and current events and discussions. It might mean reading more about, um, you know, subscribing to the medicine and healthcare um, newsletters from your favorite print media, or potentially making sure that you're subscribing to podcasts that talk about healthcare policies and healthcare systems, so that you can learn more about what's being discussed and what might be things that folks are identifying as um, places where we can improve in regards to the care that we provide to patients. And in addition, also think about whether or not maybe the questions that you struggle with could have been related to a national conversation about healthcare issues, or maybe even um, excuse me, or it could be potentially questions related to the communities that you have shared that you wanted to serve. Also, think about, is there one particular question that maybe you just really bombed, quote unquote? Again, that is probably a sign that that's something that you want to look more into, try to study up more as a way to have a more solid foundation before you reapply again. And again, as I had mentioned earlier, with the written application, we do hear about your motivation for medicine, but the interview is an opportunity for us to make sure that that motivation is consistent. And so in your interview, were you able to be clear and concise about why you want to be a physician? Were the reasons that that you shared with the interviewers, were they very specific to being a doctor, or were they more kind of overarching, I want to help people, and I love science? Because as we know, uh, wanting to help others, being part of a science field, that is very much applicable to all healthcare fields and many other professions as well. So this could be a sign for you to just kind of do some more self-reflection, to really think about how um, how you have vetted your interest and motivation for being a doctor. And then finally, were you able to get your message across? And so we really want folks to kind of think about how their communication style is coming through. There are going to be some questions where you're expected to be um, short and sweet, because, for example, like the why medicine question, it is a question that you probably are getting asked frequently. And so the expectation is that you have a solid answer for that. And then you may also get some questions that are more ethical or philosophical based. And so that's an opportunity for you to uh, be more be more about, thinking out loud, sharing your thought process. How are you breaking apart difficult um, problems to kind of look at different perspectives, as well as come up with solutions? And so depending on the question you might get, it's important for you to make sure that um, you're not too verbose with your blind medicine questions or shorter questions, and to make sure you're not too concise, when the goal of the interviewers is to really kind of understand how you think or approach scenarios. Now, with the admission committee, we are looking at how prepared you are um, for medicine and for medical school, but the reality is also we are making decisions about um, the whole entire class, and we are considering applicants in comparison to the others who are applying as well. So one thing to kind of be mindful of is that your interview could have been uh, great, but because we're still making decisions holistically, we are still keeping in mind your written application materials. And although you might have been invited to interview, it is possible that there still are parts of your written application or your activities that could be stronger, or it could be an opportunity for more development. Another thing to keep in mind again is because we are making decisions about applicants in comparison to the rest of the pool, it is possible that when you applied, you may have a solid application and you may have had a solid interview, but it was just a lot of really strong candidates who are applying. So one of the things that we do recommend for reapplicants is to, well, this is, I guess, is advice for all applicants. Apply when you're ready, when you feel like you have all the activities and experiences that have really informed you into going into medicine. And then when you're thinking about reapplying, making sure to take some time off to ensure that you have new experiences, new perspectives that you can share and build upon your previous application. So that is our last slide. And I just want to go ahead and we're going to go ahead and go into common questions. So thank you so much for folks who submitted questions in advance. We have picked out a couple, and we also want to encourage folks to use the Q&A function in Zoom to ask additional questions. So because the session is about reapplying, please be aware that we are going to prioritize questions related to the reapplication process or improving applications. And if we have time, we will get to other applications as well. So the first question that we're going to talk about that was submitted in advance was, how do I know what I am missing? So I'm going to go ahead and invite Sarah to talk about this question.
Yeah, thank you. This is a tricky one insofar as there is a lot of information that you provided in your application and potentially your interview. And so one of the ways to determine what pieces might be troubling you is to check the AAMC competencies. The link is already posted. This is the pre-med competencies for entering medical students from the AAMC, and it lists all the different pieces, all the different things that medical schools are looking for in entering medical students. And one thing that can be really helpful is reflecting on these and considering not just, do I meet these competencies, but how have I shown medical schools that I have these competencies, right? So it's not enough to be, for example, a curious learner or an empathetic person. You have to show us that in your application and or your interview so that we know that you have that. So I think one thing we have found is a lot of folks, where they stumbled may be about showing us what you have. And that's not just saying, I am an empathetic person, right? That's showing us through your experiences, your reflections, your patient stories. So that can be one way to sort of evaluate yourself, is to go through those competencies to see, how am I demonstrating these pieces to committees? And I think Alex had something else she wanted to add. Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, another way that I also recommend for folks to look at this, and this applies to first-time applicants as well as reapplicants, is that when, knowing what the competencies are from the AAMC, is also going to go look at our kind of admissions requirements and thinking about this in a more compartmentalized sort of way, where functionally you can think of your application as being a series of blocks that are kind of all tied together by the glue that is the statements and the phrasing of your application. And so you can sort of think about it as like, there's your academics, which is your GPA and your MCAT. There's your letters of recommendation. There's your clinical experience, your community service. And so all of these little separate portions are things that we expect you to provide on your application, and then sort of provide a storyline that sort of weaves it all together to demonstrate your motivation to be a physician. And so, especially considering that folks are often on a limited time because you are thinking of maybe applying like next year or within a 2-year time span or along those lines, is to sort of reflect on your application either from a previous year, or where you have it right now, and really just sort of think like, how well have I currently met all of these individual blocks? So just and then sort of like in order, and then try to tackle them in order of the ones that you have the weakest sort of strength in at this time, and sort of think about it from the perspective of opportunity cost. Um, for example, if your GPA and MCAT, you can check out the stats on our website, but if your GPA and MCAT, for example, are like a 3.5 and like a 5.10, like that's pretty close to our matriculating average. It could well be that if you have, 6 months to a year left before you're applying again, focusing on getting a better MCAT score when you might have not a lot of different clinical experiences is not the best way to spend your time. Or some other iteration of these many combinations. So I would generally really recommend like breaking it down and thinking about it in this really sort of practical sense and spending your time where it most matters, where you think it will most matter for you. Um, and for some of y'all, that might just be finding a way to translate that better into your statements, uh, and how you are conveying that to the committee rather than having to necessarily double down and repeat some of these things, uh, uh, because you think that maybe you just didn't get a good enough MCAT the first time. And yeah, so I'd say, yeah, just break it into pieces, and it makes it a lot more digestible that way too. And so I will read our next question on the next slide, please. And the question is, yeah, when do I reapply? And
Yeah,
that is for Sonia.
thanks. Yeah, I will. Apologies for falling out of Zoom somehow earlier, mid-sentence. So we had a number of questions, again, submitted during registration that were sort of around this vein, right? They were longer, they had more details, but essentially they are, when do I reapply? And there's a question in the chat here too. Is it advantageous to take a gap year between applications if you don't have that many changes, or does it reflect poorly to not apply in back-to-back cycles? And I will say, every time I talk to people, I say there's no, well, that's not true. There's not no downside to reapplying, but there is almost always a benefit to waiting before reapplying and not applying in back-to-back cycles. Because as you all very well know, when you get your decision, to when you actually are submitting your new application is a very, very short window of time. And as Alex was talking about, if you're thinking about your opportunity cost, if you really think that it is just about how you wrote your experiences, and how you conveyed the information, that, doesn't necessarily take a huge amount of time to do. But if you think it is that you don't have the clinical experience, if it's that you don't have enough service, those things really do take time to not only complete, but to sort of fully digest and be able to talk about them and how they've impacted you, and how that makes you a good applicant for medical school. So to the question in the chat, I would say, yes, it is definitely advantageous to take a gap year between applications. And there's definitely no like red flag about people taking a year off in between or even more. I know it can feel scary. I know many people have a timeline and an agenda for when they want to do medical school, and medical training is really long, and we get that. But that being said, it's so much better to have a better application than one that's submitted sooner. And that, you sort of have to weigh that, like the opportunity cost, you have to weigh that, like, how much does it cost to apply again and to maybe not be successful again, versus really spending the year to spend some time, think about what you're doing, make changes, have like time to decompress from all the stress of doing it once, and then reapply later. And those were our, oh, I just saw a question pop up in the chat. And the question is, what if you feel like it was due to your MCAT? So, as Alex was saying earlier with the data, it might be, your MCAT might be part of it. Usually somebody's MCAT is not the only reason that they were not interviewed or accepted. If you got a pre-secondary rejection, then that is most likely due to either an MCAT or a lower GPA. And then that might be sort of the sole issue for the decision. Oh yes, that person says, yes, I did. So yeah, then that's a different circumstance. What we have found over many years is that when I talk to people, they say, I really think it's my MCAT. I got a 503. I'm like, it probably wasn't your MCAT. Oh, I mean, that's not out of the realm of normal for us. That is, it's below our average, but it's certainly not a worrying MCAT. And usually our admissions committee is looking for evidence that people can make it through medical school, not who's the top, 99th percentile MCAT score. That's not how they're looking at it. They're thinking, can this person get through? Do we think that they're, academically sound? So, if that is the case, then certainly retaking the MCAT is a worthwhile endeavor. But I would say to caution people that very rarely is it solely someone's MCAT score that made them not make it through the process. Now we're going to stop sharing, and I'm going to hand it back to Sarah to sort of walk us through. So those were when we went through all the questions, those were like the themed ones that we got, and that's how we built our presentation. But now we're going to move to talking about some of the ones that are submitted here from our live folks.
Yeah, thank you. So we're just gonna go through here. Sometimes we encourage folks to use the Q&A and not the chat. We may not be looking at the chat, but we're definitely going to be seeing the questions you post in that Q&A box. So one of the ones that came up is, do you have recommendations on ways to effectively demonstrate and share experiences towards a specific specialty of interest? For example, research, observerships, work experience. My answer for this is going to be the same answer that I give to a lot of questions, which is it depends on your goals and experiences. So part of this role is of being a pre-med and ultimately a medical student and physician is being a lifelong learner and evaluating your own experiences and how they reflect your future goals. And so if you have an interest in a particular specialty, or I'm not even going to just say specialty, but the type of medicine you want to practice. If you want to work with a specific population, or you want to work in community health, or you want to work, doing both bench research and seeing patients, right? There are a lot of different ways to have goals around medicine. It's not always just a specialty. So if you have certain goals, or maybe even not goals, but maybe you're interested, maybe you're not sure what you want to do, the answer to all those things is to explore them in the ways you can. There's not a right way to explore certain specialties, right? So especially because you are pre-med, you're in the exploratory stage right now. Once you get into medical school and you determine which specialty you're interested in, there's a whole host of people who can support you to accomplish that goal so that you can match in the field of your interest. But right now, your job is to learn as much as you can and reflect on those experiences. So, for example, right, and I think the way maybe to explain this is by going the opposite way, right? So if someone says, oh, I'm in their personal statement maybe, or in their interview, that they're interested in pediatrics, we would look at their application. And if we don't see, experiences with that patient population, we might be a little curious how it came to be. But if there's a lot of different ways to get experience in that field, and I would say like things like being a coach to a youth soccer league or volunteering at a tutoring center, right? Neither of those is clinical, but they're certainly appropriate to that interest. Another way to think about it is you are learning things from every experience that you do that is going to be relevant to being a physician regardless, right? So one example I like to give is your work experience. In your experiences, please make sure you tell us about the employment you've had. One, because we can see as part of the context of everything you've done, if you've been working a lot of hours while also trying to do your service and your clinical experience, et cetera, we're going to be able to take that into account when we do our holistic review. But the other thing about listing something like employment, even if it's not medically related, there are a lot of things you're going to learn from that role that are going to benefit you throughout the rest of your life. And I speak from, I was a barista. I grew up in Seattle in the 90s, and I learned a lot about things like, it has nothing to do with the rest of the things I do, but I did learn things about how to work as part of a team, how to maintain a positive attitude, even when things were stressful, right? How to manage having, the hierarchy of a job, people above me, people below me, all these sort of different pieces. If I were to reflect on them at the time, would have been a really valuable way to talk about, working as part of a team in the healthcare field, right? So to answer this question, there's not one way to demonstrate and share your experiences toward a specific goal. What we want to know is the journey. How have your experiences pointed you toward the interests that you have? We care less about what your specific interest is and more about how you came to that and in your journey. And when you're trying to decide what to do next, right? If you're planning to take some time before you apply and you want to figure out what should I do next to best show, I would say that is a great piece to reflect on yourself. What is the thing that I'm interested in doing? Because we often find that if you're doing something that interests you, you're more likely to get more out of it, and your reflections are going to be more real. And using the advice that Alex gave earlier about sort of breaking it up and seeing where you might need more work can help you decide too what you want to focus on. But I never want you to feel like there's one way to do it. You do A, B, C, and D, and you're in. Because we have so many applications, and every single person is bringing something a little different and their entire journey. And that's what we like. We don't want there to be one way. We want to see all the different types of people. So thank you for your question. Next up, I'll lead it over to Alex. Alex, can you read the next question and answer it for us, please?
Yeah, so this next question is how does the admissions committee weigh recent academic performance and upward GPA trends relative to cumulative GPA? Does strong post-bacc or upper level BCPM coursework carry additional weight? And how are GPA addenda and personal/professional growth considered? So basically, the bottom line is, yes, more recent academic work is generally considered, generally weighted more strongly in consideration. And this is in part due to, not everybody can get a strong 4.0 all the way through every year of college. Realistically, studying is a skill, and being able to be ready for additional academic course load is kind of in itself a skill that you have to build over time. And it is something that you can improve or something that can get a little bit rusty. So generally speaking, the admissions committee looks for evidence that the applicant is not going to be an academic concern during the MD program itself, which means unless they had a straight 4.0 GPA or zero trends in their academics, it means looking at their entire academic transcript, including their MCAT, to see what sort of a picture are they presenting to the admissions committee today. And so in this context, having an upward trajectory in your grades or an MCAT that is improving over time, those are all good things to have. And good things to show to the committee. And although your cumulative GPA, which we get from AMCAS, might not always reflect your current GPA that you may be taking at a postgrad or in a graduate degree, they will still see your entire transcript. And if you manage to get a 4.0 in a postgrad, even though your initial undergrad GPA was like closer to 3.0, they will see that your most recent work was this much better academic performance, and it will be considered as part of your overall application in a holistic sense. And uh, they will also attempt to consider what is it that you were doing while you were working on these grades that may or may not have interfered with getting a higher GPA, or if you were juggling multiple things at the same time. So all these things are generally considered, and uh, in the absence of an initially great GPA or what you might consider to be a great GPA, it is always good to have um, either follow-up improvements or a good MCAT. As a compliment. And then another thing I wanted to mention, I'm not sure that we've touched on this yet, but when you're looking at your academics in terms of like overall opportunity cost as well, it should be said that the undergrad GPA that we get from AMCAS is calculated in the way that AMCAS does it, and it's kind of a set fixed number, and there's nothing you can really sort of change about that other than like having us review your additional coursework otherwise like afterwards when we get the transcript. But the MCAT is actually something that is in your power to change generally, unless you've maxed out the amount of times that you can take it. So on the scope of things that are worth possibly doing, is if your GPA is already kind of okay, but your MCAT is suffering, consider what you can do to get a good MCAT score, because we will see your most recent MCAT score, we will see your MCAT trends, and getting a solid MCAT score to demonstrate that you have a great understanding of STEM material is very helpful to offset what might otherwise be an initially lower GPA. Um, and that might have also answered another Q&A that we had. But yes, I will pass it on to the next, I will pass it on to Alexander.
Yeah, thank you, Alexander. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So I'll read out the next question first, and then I'll go ahead and address it. So this one was about experiences. When you talk about how narrow or broad an applicant's experiences are, how do you evaluate depth within a single focus area like mental health versus breadth across different clinical settings? If most of my experiences are concentrated in one area, how can I best present that as a strength rather than a limitation? Right. So, as I mentioned before, you don't have to go in stating a preference in what kind of medicine you want to practice. But if you do, and you've done a lot um, to explore that, that right there is already starting out as a strength. How you address it, what I would say is, if it's, for example, the mental health example that was provided in the question, and you've done a lot to explore that, talk about in your description of your experiences all the different aspects of things that you learned, all the different skills that you developed, all the different experiences that you had. Um, Show your understanding of different key points. In particular, show your understanding of um, what it would mean to be a physician and what it would mean to practice in that kind of medicine, what the interaction between patients and physicians could look like. Show your understanding of all the different things that you got from it, instead of saying, look, I've got all these hours. That's not the way to approach it. The way to approach it is kind of show the breadth of things that you learned while doing a depth of exposure to a particular field or a specialty or population or whatever it is, uh, so that we can see both breadth and depth in those experiences that you've had. And I will pass on to the next, which would be Stella.
All right, so this is kind of piggybacking off of Alex's earlier question. Regarding academic requirements, is the 3.0 cumulative GPA a hard screen? I was wondering how post-bacc GPA is taken into account, say if one had 40 credits of pure sciences at a 3.9. So the answer is yes and no. So we do have an automated screen to kind of help us with the volume of applications that we get every year, and it is set to a 3.0 cumulative GPA and a 3.0 science GPA for WEMI applicants. And for out-of-region applicants, it is a 3.0 science GPA and a 3.25 cumulative GPA. Don't quote me on that one. The You will get a letter basically saying that you are not invited to complete a secondary application based on the GPA and minimum MCAT cutoff. But if you do have post-bacc coursework or graduate coursework that shows a strong upward trajectory, please advocate for yourself and email our office and we can do a manual review of your application. If I agree that your 40 credits of science GPA at a 3.9 looks solid, then I will just throw you back into the application pool for consideration. And then once you are in the screening process and the interview process, the admissions committee will have access to all of the grades that you have so that they can see your more current coursework, and that is what they're really going to be focusing on and placing the most value on, because that is really going to be more accurate snapshot of who you are and your abilities when you start medical school than say what you did in freshman year.
Thank you, Stella.
Mhm.
Alex, I think you wanted to answer this next question.
Yeah. So can you share some advice for students applying in midlife who have had a desire to pursue medicine for decades? I'm struggling to focus my narrative on why medicine and why now without my application reading like a resume. Is there an age limit, for example, on activities that we find meaningful to our whys? And so very quickly for that last part, there is no age limit for activities that you might find meaningful. Uh, Mostly because, I mean, it's what you find meaningful. That's what's important. What gives you motivation and inspires you to f pursue medicine is something that is unique to you. So use that, talk about that, and don't be afraid to talk about that because that's what makes you you. Um, and so, more broadly speaking, for students applying in midlife or non-traditional applicants, so to speak, um, I will, I guess I would harken back to sort of like my previous sentiment about multiple portions of your applications, which is that different folks have different strengths and different abilities to address all of these different portions. And ultimately, they also reflect on and tie them together in slightly different ways that are usually um, inspired by their individual life experiences. So the advice I would say first and foremost is don't compare yourself against traditional applicants that are coming out straight from undergrad because that's not our entire applicant pool and that is not even like half of our matriculant pool most of the time. We tend to get folks from all sorts of wakes and all sorts of different applicant archetypes, so to speak, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. What does matter in your application is how you take your current life experiences and motivation and formulate that into a coherent statement to then share with the admissions committee in terms of like, why you, why now? Basically, like, what is it that you've done in like your last, so for contrast, somebody fresh out of undergrad might not be able to answer like a 5 or 10 year span question for what drove them to turn their life around or do something completely different. Whereas you, as someone that might be coming from a slightly non-traditional background, has a different perspective by which to answer these things. And likely different experiences that summed up to that as well. So in short, don't take it as a disadvantage. See how you can turn your particular experiences, which are different from other folks, into your particular advantage, and turn that into your motivation on the application itself. Hopefully that helps. And I'm going to pass this next question on to Sonia.
I'm actually sorry, I want to stop there, Alex. Thank you. I just noticed that our time is running short, and I want to be sure that we get y'all done and respect your time. We're going to try to type in answers that are remaining and or reach out to folks after the session if we don't get to your questions. I want to thank you all for your questions, but also I wanted to share with you some words from one of our executive committee members. These are the folks who review applications and make decisions. And we asked them if they had any advice that they wanted to share with reapplicants when we told them we were doing this session. And we really loved this one that came from one of our committee members about successful applicants and who they are, and wanted to share it with you all because I think it reiterates what we've been talking about this session about evaluating your candidacy and finding out where you can strengthen it. And when you've done that and you know that you are meeting those competencies, that you have shown us how you're aligning with our mission, how you've done all these things, you're going to have that confidence because you're really going to know who you are and what you bring to our program. And we can't wait to see it. Finally, I wanted to end with our for more information page because we really do try to keep our process as transparent as possible. We want you to be able to put your best foot forward when applying to our program. So I encourage you to check out our website at uwmedicine.org/admissions. Some of the pages I like to highlight are the resources page that have the links to the sessions we have like this. Some virtual office hours is an option for you if you have follow-up questions. We've also got pages on the procedures, interview questions, FAQs. That clinical experiences page is really valuable too. You can also, though, if you have follow-up questions, you can reach out to us directly. After reviewing our material, if you still have questions, you can reach out to us. Or the best way to reach us is that askuwsom@uw.edu email address. I also encourage you to follow us on our socials, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. We will be posting this session on our YouTube channel. Make sure to check out, too, if you have more questions, our next session on advice from admissions, which is a almost entirely Q&A session, making sure we're answering the questions that matter most to you. So on behalf of the entire admissions team at the University of Washington School of Medicine, I want to extend our thanks to all of you for being here today, for your wonderful questions, for applying to our program, and for considering applying again. Thank you, everyone.